Bottles and closed forms. So for this piece, I'm using about 4 pounds of clay, and my goal is to make a closed form, which includes bottles, vases, sometimes a lidded vessel, the body of the lidded vessel, many forms, any form that where the rim goes inwards rather than outwards. So I'm starting out with a cylinder, and I'm going to push out the bottom part and then close in the top part to make a closed form. Now, what's important here is that you have to be careful to make sure you have enough thickness in the walls at the top or the upper portions of the piece to really be able to control your closed form. And any closed form, you are expanding the interior volume to give it a roundness. So then it's also important that to note that your piece will in general become a little shorter than the original height of the cylinder that you make. Just something to keep in mind when you're making something very specific in size. So for the cylinder, I'm ultimately going to bring the top in. So already when I'm forming it, I'm making sure that the walls don't go outwards, but rather look inwards. Kind of like you want to make sure your cylinder has a volcano kind of shape. A conic shape where it's narrower at the top. And it's also good practice to pay attention to the inside of the piece and make sure it's straight, or again going in a little narrow at the top. You don't want the bottom to have a curved outwards curve at the bottom at this point. So I'm still finishing up the cylinder, stretching the walls, making a nice even thickness. And what I'm going to do now is to open up the bottom, maybe perhaps a 2/3 of the piece outwards. So make sure you bring your hands out in a curve, and I'll start pushing in at the top once I have the general shape of the bottom 2/3 of the piece established. So I'm bringing my hands up slowly, pushing out a little bit from the inside while my outside hand supports, and make sure that I don't push out too much. If you push out too much, you'll frequently face problems where the walls start to wobble, and if you push out too much, then you can even collapse your piece in the middle. So always, as you first start making a bottle, start forming in little steps with slider curves at first, and then think about expanding and shaping the curve maybe in 2-3 pulls, maybe even 4 if you need to. Another thing that helps is to suck up the water that might pool in the middle of the piece before you start pushing in the walls. So now that I've rounded and opened up the bottom portion of this cylinder, I'm collaring from the outside to push the clay in. Notice the fingers I'm using mostly my thumb, my fingers from my thumb and to my middle finger more. My bottom pinky, the finger next to the pinky, they are not really putting too much pressure at all. It's just being relaxed, and I'm mostly forming with my thumb, my index finger, and my middle finger. Now that I've pulled, now that I've colored about 3 times, couple times, then I'm pulling the clay now to make the piece taller and also to stretch the clay more. Coloring makes the walls thicker where you end your color. So after a couple times of coloring, you always need to pull to stretch and thin out the clay a little more, and also to relieve some of the spiral tension that is caused by coloring. If you color too much, you may notice that you end up with a twist in the walls. If you do, you have to pull the walls nicely to relieve that twist. So now I'm coloring from about a little above halfway from the piece, and make sure that the bottom part there has enough support to take the pressure that you put at the top. So I'm again coloring, and at the top the piece is more fragile, so I'm using more specific areas of my hand to apply pressure right there. Now I'll show you some things you can try. Maybe you want to make sculpture, maybe you want to make a piece where it's very closed. Then you can close up your piece completely even. For me, I use these completely closed forms a lot for my sculptures or for making parts of a piece. So now I'm bringing my hands even closer in at the top and closing off the form. I make sure I have enough clay at the top, that I have a good wall thickness so I can still stretch the clay. And I'm coloring from about 2/3 of the way up, bringing my fingers in as I color, and now my piece has a very small opening. You can cut off the top flat and make this your piece, or you can keep on going and completely close the piece, which I'll do now just to show what can be done. At the end, I'm pinching at the top and applying a little pressure downwards on the top to make sure the piece is nice and compressed at the top. So any object with air inside is self-supporting. Think of a balloon. So same thing with these clay pieces that are completely closed. You can pound it when it's soft leather, and you can deform it into an oval, do some abstract gesturing to the shape. These are all very easy to do in a completely closed form. But for today, I'll demonstrate also how to make and finish the neck for a bottle. So I'm just reopening the piece and pulling the walls at the top here to make the shoulder of the piece, and use the clay for the neck. Notice how my fingers are holding on to the piece. I use water if it's dry. You don't want a lot of friction at the top, because that can also offset your bottle, and sometimes you can even rip the top of your bottle if it's too dry. Using my thumb to support, my right thumb to support my left hand, which is making the curves and pulling the walls taller for the neck. Notice my fingers work more when I'm shaping the neck. Again, the walls are very delicate and sensitive at the top. So this could be your neck. You can make it taller. You can make it wider at the top. You can shape it a little differently. But this could be the bottle shape for you. I'll play around a little more. First, I'm taking off the excess slip because I'm almost done. I'm just going to be finishing up the neck now. So I cleaned off some of the water and the slip on my piece so I can see my piece better. And again, excess water on your piece makes your piece weaker and weaker. So now I'm going to reshape the neck. And I'm going to collar up, being very careful not to put excessive pressure on the shoulder and the neck. And I'm just opening up the top of the bottle wider, using my index finger on my right hand to push in at the bottom of the neck and shaping the top portion with my rib. The curve is a little too not as sharp as I want for my piece. So now I'm taking my finger and pushing in at the bottom of that neck at the shoulder to give it more of a sharp line at the transition between the shoulder to the neck. And I think this is a nice look. So now I'm cleaning the curves and taking off the excess slip again with my rib tool. Now I'm just cut off the excess clay at the bottom. You can go medium speed to about medium to low speed when you do this. Make sure you don't knock off the piece too much. For me, when I clean off the bottom, it does wobble a little bit, but at the end, it doesn't matter when the piece is finished. Unless it's a very big tilt. So now the final touches. I'm taking my deer skin or my chamois and smoothing the top, the lip of the piece. And the lip is going a little up and down, but I like how this generally looks, so I'm going to keep it this way. Make sure you clean off your hands before you cut the piece and put it on a board. And we're done. Sometimes I put slip on the piece. I carve in bottles or nice pieces to do decorative work on also.